Welcome to IVF This, episode 161, IVF and Adoption. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today. I'm getting super excited because we're getting ready to go on a long road trip as a family. We're headed out for 2 weeks. We're going to leave Austin and we're going to drive up to Denver first and stay a few days. And then we're going to drive up to the Jackson Hole, Wyoming area for a few days. We've got a lot of really cool things planned. My personal favorite thing that I've booked, which is kind of a surprise, is a sunrise safari in the Grand Tetons. We are a family of animal lovers. So the possibility of seeing some amazing wildlife that we would never get to see here in Texas is really exciting. Also, if you know me, you know that I loathe Texas summers. And I always use this as an excuse to leave this summer, particularly in July. Give me an excuse to leave Texas in July. I just looked up the forecast for Jackson Hole starting into the week we're getting there. And the overnights in Jackson Hole are in the 40s and 50s, which is considered cold in the quote unquote winter months, which is basically January and February in Austin. And that's maybe a handful of days. So I'm bringing all of my snuggly hoodies and sweaters. And I genuinely think that I might be more excited about kind of the cooler temperatures than anything else. And I feel really grounded in that. I feel really comfortable. That is a massive motivation for me. So okay, we're going to get into the topic today. I've never really addressed the topic of adoption on this podcast for a couple of reasons. One, there are a lot of really big feelings that people have kind of inside and outside of the adoption community. And two, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to say about it until recently. I wasn't sure how I would want to frame the topic of adoption. And that kind of changed within the last couple of weeks. I was, as most of these podcast episodes kind of evolve, I was talking with one of my clients and she was telling me about some kind of frustrating conversations that she's had with people recently, with coworkers and some extended family. The whole, so when are you going to have kids conversation topic comes up as frustratingly common, as we all know. And she politely said, we're starting the IVF process. She hasn't started a stem cycle or anything. They really are. I think they're going to start in August or September, so a couple of months from now. She was talking through a little bit of that with them. And one of the first things that they said out of the gate was, well, why don't you just adopt? And we talked about that amongst some of the other things that we were talking about for that particular session. And what I just could not drop the why don't you just adopt question. It nagged at me. Specifically, let's just say specifically, why the question can come from such an ignorant place, why people tend to take that direction, and what are the things that really do need to be taken into consideration around adoption. Because I think along with all of the just relax or it'll happen when it happens, a lot of those throwaway comments, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, but a lot of those throwaway comments are not necessarily, I don't tend to believe, not that it's not possible, I don't tend to believe that they're malicious in nature. I do tend to think that they are very thoughtless. And of many things in this world that are not to be gone into in a thoughtless manner, adoption is one of them. And so this podcast is more about giving you words, giving you explanations for when people do bring up that, and you getting to choose how you want to respond to those questions or those comments, because I know that they come up very often. And I think even when I can look back and remember some of those comments, some of those conversations, especially after we had our first kid and we were going through our first IVF cycle, was the why don't you just adopt? I couldn't really articulate in a way that I felt comfortable or confident in that would answer their question, maybe even educate, because I would get so lost in the frustration. And there's nothing wrong with getting lost in the frustration. But if perhaps this is an important relationship to you, or you have some enormous amount of patience that day and want to do some education, that's what this podcast episode is around. Okay. So before I get started, I'm getting kind of nervous. I keep touching my chest because I know that this is such a hot button topic. So I want to be very clear with my words that this is solely for educational purposes. There is no hate, no shade to anyone who has adopted, is considering adoption, or is pursuing adoption, right? This is not directed to anyone specifically or any situation specifically. I have my own personal thoughts about adoption, but that's not what this platform is for. Again, I just want to be able to give you language or discussion points or things to bring into a conversation with someone who maybe is asking about, why don't you just adopt? Or maybe they continue to bring adoption into conversations that you're having with them about IVF. Okay. That's the only reason for this episode. Okay. This episode is more about helping you to flesh out kind of those more complex, nuanced topics or issues or points, and why it can be such a problematic thing to ask people who are going through infertility. Okay. We're all friends here. It's all love. That's what we're doing. Okay. So, first and foremost, when people broach the topic of adoption, it most likely, unless they are either adoptees or have adopted, comes from a lack of understanding. A lot of people see adoption as like this easy fix, kind of like swapping out a broken light bulb. They don't realize how emotionally, financially, legally, psychologically complex this entire issue can be, right? They're trying to offer a quick solution to make the pain go away, or what they perceive to be your pain go away. But very often it comes off as extremely dismissive because there is the emotional toll. People dealing with infertility are often we're already navigating deep grief and loss in many different ways, right? So suggesting adoption without acknowledging these emotions can feel very dismissive of our pain. The financial cost, not that IVF is cheap or free, but adoption is also an incredibly expensive venture, sometimes costing tens and tens of thousands of dollars. I think the national average is something like $45,000 to $60,000 for adoption. And depending on where you're living and what type of IVF cycle you're going through, that could be 2 to 3 cycles of IVF for yourself. So it's already a financial burden on top of a financial burden that you have likely already experienced with fertility treatments. And then there are the legal complexities to it, right? The legal process of adoption can be very long and extremely complicated, involving home studies, legal fees, and sometimes even dealing with interstate or international laws. I think some people have this idealized view of adoption, right? People often see adoption through, again, from a place of misinformation or uneducated or ignorance with these rose-colored glasses. They think it's all sunshine and rainbows, like, hey, you're going to have a child at home. What could be better? They miss the parts about potential attachment issues, grief of the birth parents, and the challenges of trans or cross-cultural adoption, right? Some children, especially children adopted from foster care or internationally, may have some very serious attachment disorders due to previous trauma. So keeping the pain and the trauma and the loss and the grief of the child at the center, but it's also going to be a massively traumatic experience for you and your partner, or even if it's just by yourself, if you're adopting solo. Bringing someone into your home is a traumatic experience. Okay. That doesn't mean, like, I'm not talking, of course, about your grandparents coming to visit. I mean, bringing a new life into your home that is going to live there permanently is a massive shock to the system. Okay. So we want to be very aware of that. We also want to take into consideration, or at least be empathetic and compassionate around the grief of the birth parents. Birth parents often experience profound grief and loss, which can be lifelong and extremely impactful. The transracial and cross-cultural challenges adopting a child from a different race or culture comes with its own set of challenges, including helping a child develop a strong cultural identity and dealing with potential aspects of racism or discrimination, right? Those are things that we think gloss over when we just toss out questions like, why don't you just adopt? I think every time I ask that question from henceforth in the podcast episode, I'm going to do a more ridiculous voice because that's how I hear it in my brain. Why don't you just adopt? I'm sure you enjoyed that one. Thank you very much. Okay. Another one is like an unawareness of challenges. There's so much more to adoption than just filling out a bunch of paperwork and bringing a child home. The legal hurdles, the waiting periods, the potential for failed matches. It's so emotionally, mentally, and can be physically taxing. And that's before you even get on the emotional roller coaster for both the child, the intended adoptee, and the intended parents, right? The waiting periods, it can take years. Long waiting periods can be emotionally, financially, mentally draining. There are failed matches, right? Sometimes adoptions fall through at the last minute. I have several friends who have adopted previously, and they would be on their way to the hospital for their intended child as intended parents, and the adoption would fall through. And that's beyond devastating for prospective or potential parents who've already been emotionally invested in the process and bringing that baby home. And then, of course, all of us are familiar with the emotional roller coaster. The process is filled with so many ups and downs, dealing with potential rejection from birth parents, and of course, navigating all of the complexity of maybe considering open versus closed adoptions. You know, it's not going to be a podcast for Emily if we don't talk about the cultural or social implications, the norms and the pressure. Many cultures, having a kid is a really big deal, and there's this pressure to fix, quote unquote, fix the infertility issue as quickly as possible. So adoption can seem like a straightforward alternative. I will, remind you of the first point that I talked about misunderstanding or misinformation around adoption. So for many, it's not about having a child. It's about the experience of pregnancy and childbirth too. And that's okay. Right there, because we do experience this pressure that the society often places on us as individuals to have children, us experiencing infertility, we already kind of feel judged inadequate. And I know I softened that with kind of. I felt very judged and very inadequate and very misunderstood at multiple parts during my infertility journey. So there's that. There's the desire for biological children. I never wanted to adopt. I wanted biological children. I don't think that makes someone a bad person or a morally abject or bankrupt person. I also don't think that choosing to adopt from a place of I want to be a savior to children is, again, that would, in my opinion, would fall kind of outside the scope of that being a child-centered process. And then, of course, there's family expectations. Your family members might be pressuring you and not fully understanding the complexities or the emotional significance of the infertility journey. Emotional distance is something that we talk about a lot in the world of adoption, right? We actually talk about emotional distance a lot within reference to donated materials, donated eggs, donated sperm, and donated embryos. Infertility is already a tough topic for the vast majority of people to talk about. And so sometimes people suggest adoption because it's easier in their opinion than dealing with the raw emotions of grief and loss that come with infertility. And that shifts in their mind the conversation to something that's much more positive, right? Because the avoidance of those painful conversations, albeit understandable, people might suggest adoption just to avoid having that conversation around grief and loss. Because, and I'm going to talk about this in the next episode, people's ability for emotional tolerance, handling uncomfortable emotions, is very limited for the vast majority of people in this world. And going back to that desire to fix, we have a human tendency to want to fix quote unquote problems, and suggesting that adoption can seem like a way to solve the problem of infertility. You can almost follow the logic without really buying into the logic. And again, I'm going to say it kind of allows the person asking the question or posing the question to have a more positive spin on an otherwise uncomfortable situation. People misunderstanding or downplaying the importance of the biological connection. Having a desire for biological children runs deep for many people. It's not just about having a child with a genetic link, it's experiencing pregnancy and all that comes with it. So suggesting adoption can feel like telling someone their deep desires don't really matter, or beggars can't be choosers is probably one of my least favorite phrases in the entire world. We want, right, that we're biologically wired to want a genetic connection with our children, which is very natural, right? It's very deeply ingrained. It doesn't mean that we can't have strong, nurturing connections with adoptees. That's not what this is about. This is about people asking that question can downplay what some of us, many of us, feel very strongly about having that desired link. Many of us want to experience pregnancy and childbirth as significant experiences for many of us, right? And we can grieve. People do grieve losing out on that experience if they cannot have it. And then, family lineage, that it also comes into play. I think also there's an oversimplification, right? Saying just adopt oversimplifies the decision-making process. It's not like choosing a new brand of cereal or going out to buy a new car. It involves an intense amount of soul searching, very likely heartbreak, heartache, and navigating an obnoxiously complex system. The decision to adopt is so complex and so deeply personal that going into it without having experienced or thought about the grief or the complexities or the soul searching, having multiple discussions on multiple fronts over a long period of time, that is involved with adoption. I actually have not met someone who has adopted that didn't experience all of the emotional upheaval around that decision, all of the potential heartache. I talk a lot about how IVF is like laying your heart on a chopping block and handing someone else the cleaver, and adoption is really no different. You are not in control of much of the process and certainly none of the outcome. And then, of course, the obnoxiously complicated system. So, even with all of that information, I think what upsets me most is that it's very dismissive, intentionally or unintentionally, to the unique challenges and trauma of adoption. Things like identity struggles. If you guys heard me talk a lot before, I do really love the app TikTok. I do spend quite a bit of time scrolling adoptees of TikTok. I really love hearing their perspective. It has really changed the way that I think about things. I also watch the adopting TikTok videos from like the intended parents' perspective. I want to kind of have that balanced approach. One of the biggest topics that adoptees talk about is the identity struggle. Right now, I want you to imagine growing up with questions swirling around about who you are and where you come from. Adopted kiddos grapple with these all the time, these big, giant existential questions, sometimes from a very young age, right? And it's not just about the mystery of their biological parents. It's also about finding their place between these two worlds, right? Their birth family and their adoptive family. And this can lead for many of them to like an identity crisis, especially during some of the most tumultuous years of your life, your teenage years and into your early 20s. There's a lot of emotional baggage. Even if a child is adopted at infancy, there's often an undercut of the loss and abandonment, that severing of the biological tie that can bubble up at many different stages in life. These feelings can be like unexpected guests showing up at super inconvenient times. And those need to be handled with gentleness and compassion and a great deal of love, similar to how I tell you guys to talk to yourself, right? Cultural disconnection, right? Adopting children from another culture or country can be a beautiful, enriching experience, but it will not come without challenges, right? Your child might struggle to balance their birth culture with their adopted family culture. And it's a really delicate dance of honoring their heritage while feeling at home in their family with maybe people who don't look like them, right? It requires sensitivity and openness and sometimes a lot of creativity to kind of bridge those gaps. For many, there can be medical history gaps. Have you ever had to go to a doctor and rattle off your entire family's medical history? Now imagine doing that with significant gaps, right? Adoptive parents often don't have a complete medical history for their child, which can complicate things when and if health issues arise. It's like trying to solve a puzzle without having all of the pieces and never seeing the finished product, right? So it can be a very stressful experience when you're trying to keep up with and trying to keep your little one healthy. There's a question of open versus closed adoptions. It isn't so much about how much information is shared. It can deeply impact a child's sense of privacy and their relationship with both their birth and adoptive families. Open adoptions can lead to beautiful ongoing relationships, but also require, I would imagine, a considerable amount of boundaries and clear communication. Closed adoptions can simplify things maybe in the shorter run, but can leave a lot of unanswered questions hanging in the air. There's a lot of stereotypes and stigmas. Society has come a long way understanding adoption, but adoptive families often face stereotypes and stigmas that can be hurtful or downright frustrating or discriminating, whether it's intrusive questions or ignorant comments. These societal or social misunderstandings can add extra layers of challenge to an already complicated journey for both the kiddo and for you. I talked about attachment challenges earlier. Really challenging if they've experienced a lot of trauma or instability or neglect in their lives to form healthy attachments, right? To form secure attachments. If you're familiar with attachment theory at all, secure attachments are kind of the ideal way to be attached. And a lot of times when children are adopted from these very chaotic, dysfunctional homes, you see things like disorganized attachment, avoidant attachment, or anxious attachment. And if you're interested in that, just Google attachment theory. You will get all the information. But that requires a lot of patience and consistency and arguably professional support to help build that trust and that bond. Sibling dynamics, right? Adopting a sibling can shake up the dynamics, just like bringing a child in can shake up the dynamic of children, right? That's not necessarily exclusive to adoption. It's just a really specific way that it can look for a family. It's not about just making space in your home for them, but also in the hearts of your other children, right? Jealousy, competition, and confusion about roles can arise, and it takes thoughtful navigation. The financial burden, the adoption experience is a very expensive journey, and the costs don't stop once the paperwork is signed, right? There's ongoing expenses for therapy, healthcare, specialized education if the child has additional needs or support requirements. It's a financial commitment that requires planning and oftentimes sacrifice. Birth family reunions. As kids get older, they may express a desire to reconnect with their birth family, both beautiful and often very complex, full of emotional highs and lows, everyone involved. Navigating these waters with sensitivity, understanding, and again, a whole lot of love. The legal complexities. The legal process can be long, complicated, and oftentimes they don't go as planned. And so that requires patience, persistence, and often a knowledgeable guide. And then, of course, the societal expectations of adoptive parents that they should be perfect, when that can be very overwhelming because, let's face it, parenting is really freaking hard no matter how your family is formed. So it's important to remember that you're doing your best and that it's okay to seek support along the way. So that was everything I wanted to talk about in terms of why the phrase or why the question, just adopt, why don't you just adopt or just adopt, is so troubling for me. It can be a good opportunity to share some of these insights. I understand that not everything that I say in the podcast lands for everyone, but if you've had that question, or you've contemplated why that question is so frustrating for you to hear, I hope this at least gives you a language or give you words or ideas or topics that you can touch upon. Because I think very often we feel helpless in those situations, right? We don't want to react out of anger because, we're trying to be grown, mature adults or whatever. But I think when we have nothing but our frustration, we can feel very helpless. So I hope this helps you feel a little bit more empowered as you're going into conversations around adoption, or just, getting the 1-2 punch of, when are you going to have your kids? And then, why don't you just adopt? I hope this gives you talking points that you can turn to so that you don't have to feel so out of control or so helpless in those situations. So that is what I have for you today. I hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you again next week. Have a beautiful week. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.